In 2011, Italian surgeon Paolo Macchiarini took a plastic tube, coated it with a patient's stem cells, and inserted it into his throat instead of his trachea. The patient's name was Andemariam Teklesenbet Bayene. A graduate student from Eritrea, 36 years old, studied in Iceland. A slowly growing tumor was blocking his airway. Doctors in Reykjavik recommended palliative care, supportive therapy with no hope of a cure. But one of his doctors contacted Macchiarini, a super surgeon, a pioneer of regenerative medicine, a man who did the impossible. Newspapers called him the surgeon of the future. The New York Times dedicated his front page to him. The Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, the very same institute that awards the Nobel Prize in medicine, invited him to be a visiting professor. The world of medicine lay at his feet, and Bayene believed. He agreed to the operation. Macchiarini created an artificial trachea from a plastic scaffold seeded with the patient's stem cells and transplanted it. A worldwide sensation, the first ever fully synthetic organ transplant. Headlines on every continent. Macchiarini became a star. Bayene died in 2014, 3 years after the operation. The trachea didn't take. The plastic didn't become living tissue. The stem cells didn't develop into a functioning organ, because that couldn't happen. This was known, but not to Bayene, and not to the journalists, and not to the administration of the Karolinska Institute. They all learned this too late. Bayene wasn't the only one. Christopher Lyles, 30, an American from Baltimore, tracheal cancer, surgery in 2011 at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. Macchiarini transplanted a second synthetic trachea, the same design, the same plastic, the same stem cells. Lyles died 4 months later. His widow, Shelley, would later tell reporters, "They promised him life. They said it was his only chance. They gave him death." Yasim Çetir, a Turkish teenager. Her trachea was accidentally damaged during a routine operation for a cyst. Not a tumor, not cancer, just a complication. She had a future. Macchiarini took on the saving task. Convinced her family that a synthetic trachea would give her a normal life. He transplanted it. Çetir died in agony. Jadira Iglikova, a 25-year-old graduate student from Russia. She underwent surgery in Krasnodar in 2010 with Russian surgeon Vladimir Parshin under the direction of Macchiarini. After the surgery, she couldn't speak at all. She couldn't stand properly. Within a few years, she was practically housebound, only going out for doctor's appointments. She died in 2018 from chronic pneumonia, a tracheoesophageal fistula, and severe malnutrition. 8 years of suffering. 8 years of a life that wasn't life. 7 of the 8 patients who received Macchiarini's synthetic tracheas died. 7 of 8. The only survivor was Claudia Castillo, the first patient to receive a stem cell-infused donor trachea, not a fully synthetic one. But she too had a lung amputated in 2016. Macchiarini presented each operation as a breakthrough. He published articles in The Lancet and other leading journals. The article on Bayene claimed that 5 months after the operation, the patient had no complications. This was a lie. Complications began almost immediately. Macchiarini knew, his co-authors knew, but the article was published, and the world believed it. Pierre Delaire, a trachea expert at the University of Leuven in Belgium, put it bluntly, "When you insert a synthetic trachea, you have one certainty: the patient will die." He used people as test subjects not to help them, but to make his name famous. Delaire was one of the first to sound the alarm. He was ignored. In 2014, 4 researchers at the Karolinska Institute, Carl Henrik Grinemo, Oscar Simonson, Matthias Korbut, and Thomas Fuchs, filed a formal complaint against Macchiarini. They spent thousands of hours trying to reconstruct the true picture. They studied every publication. They compared the documented surgical results with what Macchiarini described in scientific articles. The discrepancy was monstrous. A patient was described as complication-free after 5 months. In reality, he was already dying from tracheal failure. Another patient in the article demonstrates normal function. In reality, he was in intensive care. Ethical approvals for the surgeries were granted retroactively or not at all. Data was manipulated to fit the desired outcome. The institute commissioned an external review. The reviewer, Surgeon Bengt Gerdien from Uppsala University, examined everything and concluded, scientific falsification was confirmed. Macchiarini was guilty. The Institute read the conclusion and rejected it in August 2015. Officially, it stated, "Insufficient grounds for finding violations." The real reason was different. Urban Lendl, secretary of the Nobel Committee for Physiology or Medicine, was personally involved in inviting Macchiarini to the Institute. Several high-ranking staff members signed documents approving his work. Admitting error meant admitting that the Nobel Institute, home of the most prestigious prize in medicine, had hired a fraudster, turned a blind eye to the deaths of patients, and persecuted those who told the truth. This was impossible. So the whistleblowers were persecuted, and the fraudster was left alone. And now, the second line of this story, the one that would make prosecutor Lori Lisi say, "That doesn't happen." February 2013. NBC News producer Benita Alexander arrives at the Karolinska Institute to film a documentary about a supersurgeon. She's a two-time Emmy Award winner, a professional investigative journalist, and the mother of a 9-year-old daughter. In June of that year, her child's father dies of brain cancer. Alexander is grief-stricken, and at that moment, at the lowest point in her life, Macchiarini enters her world. He speaks 6 languages, he has impeccable manners, he has a charm that Karolinska Institute staff compared to George Clooney, the sexy George Clooney thing, as Alexander described him in an interview with Vanity Fair. He knew how to listen in such a way that you felt unique. He knew how to say exactly the right thing at the right moment. He engaged in love bombing, a manipulation tactic in which a partner is bombarded with attention, gifts, and exclusivity until they lose critical perception. Exotic trips, expensive restaurants, constant "you're special." Alexander would later say, "He was an incredibly skilled pathological liar. I was mesmerized." They began dating. A journalist filming a movie about the surgeon became his lover, then his fiancée, and then his weapon. When the New York Times published the first major article about doubts about Macchiarini's work, Alexander, love-struck, unaware, was engaged in crisis management. She helped fend off attacks because she believed. On Christmas Day 2013, Macchiarini proposed. She accepted. And here begins the part of the story that's unbelievable. Macchiarini told Alexander that their wedding would be officiated by Pope Francis himself. At the Vatican's summer residence, Castel Gandolfo, a 4-day ceremony, Andrea Bocelli and John Legend would sing at the wedding. The guest list included Barack and Michelle Obama, Bill and Hillary Clinton, and Vladimir Putin. Alexander ordered 4 wedding dresses for different days. She sent out invitations. She quit her job at NBC on May 13, 2015, to move to Europe with Macchiarini. She believed. Her friends believed. Her family believed. Because she believed. On May 14th, the day after she was fired, a friend sent her an email. Subject: Pope. Inside, a link to an article. Pope Francis would be in South America in July, on the other side of the planet from Castel Gandolfo. On the very day the wedding was supposed to take place, Alexander showed the article to Macchiarini. He wasn't fazed. He explained, former Pope Benedict was trying to sabotage the wedding out of jealousy. Vatican intrigue. He would fix everything. Sound crazy? Crazy. But Alexander believed it. For a few more days. Then she hired a private detective. The results destroyed everything. Macchiarini was married for 29 years to a woman named Emanuela Pecchia. They never divorced. At the same time, he had another mistress in Barcelona. He had 2 small children with her. He lived with them. Pope Francis, through a Vatican press secretary, stated that he had never heard the name Macchiarini and never promised to officiate anyone's wedding. Andrea Bocelli's wife confirmed the singer had no plans to perform. The Obamas, the Clintons, Putin, none of them were invited. Nothing he said was true, not a word. He also claimed to be a secret doctor to heads of state, that he worked for the CIA, that he was a sniper, that he personally treated the Pope. Every claim was a lie, a verifiable, provable, absurd lie. And yet, they believed it. Not just Alexander, colleagues, administrators, journalists, entire institutions. Because he said it with such calm, such confidence, such detail, that it was harder not to believe it than to believe it. Alexander called off the wedding. She donned a blonde wig to avoid recognition and, with 2 friends, went to Macchiarini's house in Barcelona. She saw him with another woman and their children, with her own eyes. on the street where he lived a life she'd never suspected existed. Everything collapsed simultaneously. In January 2016, Swedish documentary filmmaker Bosse Lindqvist released a 3-part series on SVT, Swedish National Television. The film featured interviews with patients, their families, whistleblowers, and Alexander herself. The impact was immediate. The Karolinska Institute, which had cleared Macchiarini the year before, now announced it would not renew his contract. In March 2016, he was dismissed early. The Institute's vice-chancellor resigned. The secretary of the Nobel Committee, Urban Lendahl, left. The dean of the faculty resigned. 3 board members resigned. The Institute, which awards the Nobel Prize in Medicine, found itself at the center of the largest scandal in its history. In 2017, the Swedish prosecutor's office charged Macchiarini with the manslaughter of 3 patients, Bayene, Lyles, and Chater. Charges were dropped a few months later as prosecutors decided there was insufficient evidence to support a murder charge. In 2020, the case was reopened, this time under the charge of grievous bodily harm. Prosecutor Mikael Björk interviewed witnesses in 5 countries and collected new written evidence. The trial took place in April and May 2022. Macchiarini and his lawyer argued that the patients were hopeless. The surgeries were performed as compassionate care, and they had no other options. Prosecution witnesses refuted this. Bayene had a slowly growing tumor. Minor surgeries could have sustained him for years. Chater also had alternatives. Every patient had a non-lethal option. June 16, 2022. First instance verdict. Guilty of causing bodily harm on 1 count. Suspended sentence. Both parties filed appeals. June 21, 23. Svea Court of Appeal. New verdict. Guilty of serious violence on 3 counts. 2.5 years in prison. The court ruled Macchiarini acted with criminal intent. He knew the operations were unlikely to help. He knew the risks. He was indifferent to the suffering of patients. The prosecution asked for 5 years. They got 2.5. Macchiarini appealed to the Supreme Court of Sweden. In October 23rd, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. The verdict came into force. Macchiarini must go to prison. But here's a detail that makes your teeth ache. Macchiarini lives in Barcelona, not in Sweden. He's an Italian citizen. According to EU rules, a convicted person serves his sentence in the country where he has the best chance of rehabilitation and reintegration. That means Spain. The Swedish authorities must forward the sentence to the Spanish authorities. The Spanish authorities must agree. The bureaucracy could take months. And in Spain, parole is possible after serving 1/3 of the sentence. In Sweden, it's after 2/3. Whistleblower Thomas Fuchs publicly expressed concern that Macchiarini will try to secure house arrest with an electronic bracelet instead of actual imprisonment. As of 2026, his status remains the subject of legal negotiations between Sweden and Spain. Netflix released the documentary series Bad Surgeon, Love Under the Knife in November 23rd. It consisted of 3 episodes. Peacock released the 2nd season of the fictional series Dr. Death, starring Edgar Ramirez as Macchiarini and Mandy Moore as Alexander. Alexander directed her own documentary. He lied about everything. She founded Baraka Productions, which helps women victims of fraud. She also hosts a podcast. Macchiarini's story even inspired an opera. The 4 whistleblowers, Grinamo, Simonson, Corbett, and Fuchs, spent 5 years and thousands of hours investigating. Their reward was harassment and persecution by the leadership of the Karolinska Institute. Grinamo was found guilty of scientific misconduct for co-authoring one of Macchiarini's papers, the very one he had debunked. Simonson received a reprimand. The Institute used their own investigation against them. That's what makes this story not just horrific, but systemic. Macchiarini didn't act alone. The Karolinska Institute invited him, funded him, protected him, rejected an independent expert's conclusion about falsification, fired the whistleblowers, and continued to do so until Swedish television broadcast the whole thing live to the nation. The system didn't break. The system worked exactly as it was designed. To protect reputations, not patients. 7 people didn't die because one surgeon turned out to be a fraud. They died because an entire institute, home of the Nobel Prize, decided that reputation was more important than the truth. Macchiarini inserted plastic tubes into the throats of living people, knowing they would die. Published articles describing dead patients as healthy. Lied to his fiancée that the Pope would officiate their wedding. Lied that he worked for the CIA. Lied that he was a sniper. And the world believed him. Because he said it in a white coat within the walls of the Nobel Institute on the cover of the New York Times. And because not believing it meant admitting that the system we entrust our lives to could be designed just like that.